On New Year's Eve of 1970, Noel Marshall, a film producer, strikes up a conversation with a man by the name of William Peter Blatty, who tells him about a book he's writing where a 12-year-old girl gets possessed by a demon, requiring an exorcism. Marshall, in turn, tells William about a film he's making, following the life of a family that lives with 40 wild lions. But little did Noel know, this conversation would inevitably lead him to questioning if the famous curse of the exorcist was plaguing his movie. Because after 70 onset injuries, multiple people getting bitten and scalped by lions, your entire film crew quitting, 2 set-destroying floods, a fire outbreak, millions of dollars lost due to damages causing the film's production to last 11 years, you should probably start suspecting something supernatural is afoot, which is exactly what Noel Marshall did for his movie called Roar. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, grab a seat and join me as we try and make sense of the insane filming and production that happened for a movie you've probably never heard of. My name's Alex Archives, and I hope you enjoy. Now I want to start with a brief summary of the plot so that you can also question how the hell they came up with this idea for a film. Roar follows the story of a researcher in Africa named Hank who lives with roughly 30 to 40 wild lions, tigers, leopards, jaguars, panthers, and cougars. Hank is currently researching the big cats, and he believes that the best way to do that is to occupy the same space as them. For reference, I'm 6'1" and weigh about 85 kilograms. This is how big an adult lion is in comparison to me. Now imagine 40 of those living in your home. But at least Hank isn't alone, as he does have an assistant named Mativo, who is the most sensible character in this entire movie, as he is the only person who seems to realize, get this, that lions can be kind of dangerous. So Hank and Mativo are preparing for Hank's family to arrive from America as they go out to fetch them from the airport. The family, consisting of Madeline? In the entire 1 hour and 34 minutes of this movie, no one said her name, so I'm not sure how to pronounce it, so we'll just go with Hedren and you'll see why in a minute. Anyways, Hedren and her 3 kids, John, Jerry, and Melanie, arrive early, and instead of waiting, they get a lift and head on over to Hank's home, causing a comedic mix-up as the family heads to the house while Hank heads to the airport. Now, as this family arrives at the house, we find out that Hank never told them what kind of research he was doing, so this poor, unsuspecting family walks into a house filled with more lions than they could count, and absolute chaos ensues. We spend the next hour watching this mother and her 3 kids fear for their lives as they try and escape this newfound hell, all while Hank's humming a catchy tune as he rides his bicycle. It's now that I'd like to mention that this movie was intended to be a lighthearted comedy with an underlying theme that speaks to preservation of wildlife, specifically big cats in Africa. To me, this is a horror movie. Why, you didn't ask? Because I spent the majority of this film fearing for these actors' lives, due to the fact that at the very start of the movie, they tell us that they deliberately chose to use untrained animals, meaning that almost all the big cats you see aren't domesticated. Do you know how dangerous that is? It's such a bad idea. This is an insane premise for a film, and it makes you question how something like this was even made. So I did the research, and it turns out that the production behind this movie is even more disastrous than the film itself. So let's dive into the behind the scenes of Roar as we look at how this film was made and justifiably why people think it's cursed. Tippi Hedren and Noel Marshall, the creators of Roar, were working on a film in Zimbabwe during 1969, when on one of their off days, the couple followed a guided safari tour in Mozambique. They came across an abandoned farmhouse which was owned by a game warden but was now taken over by a pride of lions. Hedren recalls seeing lions laying on the porch or in the windows or even once sleeping on an old rocking chair. Hedren and Marshall were quickly captivated, and as they were driving away, Marshall suggested that they should make a movie about this. Now, unfortunately, this wasn't Dungeons and Dragons, so both Hedren and Marshall were not exactly proficient in animal handling. The only experience Marshall has with animals was working part-time as a teenager at St. Louis Zoo, while Hedren, who is going to be our main character in this story, actually has some rather horrible memories working with birds. If you're a cinephile or someone born in the 1960s, you might recognize the name Tippi Hedren as the star of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, or as Gen Z might know her, Dakota Johnson's grandmother? The Birds is a horror film where birds revolt against humanity and punish us for taking Mother Nature for granted. The reason I bring this film up is because there are multiple scenes where Hedren's character is attacked by our feathered friends, and how they shot those scenes was by locking Hedren's character in a room and having people literally fling living birds at her. This went on for 5 days, and Hedren suffered multiple cuts and bruises, as well as nearly losing an eye. And by the way, that was Hedren's first ever movie, and to this day, Hedren says that she would rather still work with lions than ravens. The birds must have been a horrible experience, as you could probably tell, and thankfully Hedren came out stronger for it. Now back in Zimbabwe, Hedren and Marshall met up with a man named Ozzy Bristow, who, as his name implies, is an experienced animal handler for films. Ozzy, little did he know, actually played a huge part in the conception of Roar, as he was the person who introduced Hedren and Marshall to his domesticated lion named Dandelion. That's a brilliant name for a lion, by the way. Dandelion would be the big catch that would change Hedren and Marshall's understanding of lion behavior. No longer were these animals thought of as dangerous beasts, but instead they became cute and cuddly. Ozzy would warn Hedren and Marshall by saying that although Dandelion can be friendly towards humans, all it takes is a bit of possessiveness and he would revert back to his animal instincts. It took Ozzy years of spending all of his time with Dandelion just to get him accustomed to people, so thus training a lion was no easy feat, and Hedren and Marshall wanted 30 of them, to which Ozzy laughed and said, "1 lion, yes. 30? No, what's wrong with you?" In hindsight, Hedren admits that her and Marshall were a little in over their heads during this time, and that if she knew then the hardships that she would have to face because of this movie, she might have reconsidered walking down this path. But she didn't, and we're here now, so... Marshall and Hedren would go on a little holiday in Africa after they wrapped up filming in Zimbabwe. It was during this time that they cooked up the plot for Roar. That plot being, and I quote, "What if the game warden came back to that abandoned house?" I'll tell you right now, all they did was change game warden to researcher, gave him a family, and then left the ending open for further plot development, and then they never touched that script again. After the holiday, Hedren and Marshall went back to America and started talking to friends and business associates about their killer new film idea. The general consensus from everyone that spoke to Hedren and Marshall was that they were crazy, which honestly fair. Here's a couple that have zero experience working with animals, let alone lions, and they want to make a movie with humans coexisting with 30 big cats. Hedren even comments that realistically only Disney, the multi-million-dollar company, was capable of creating such a film at the time. Now in 1970, Hedren and Marshall began visiting wildlife reserves to learn more about lions. It was during this time that they found out just how serious of an issue poaching is, and decided that while they wanted to make a entertaining family film, they also wanted the movie to speak towards wildlife preservation, going so far as to tell us in the end credits to boycott businesses that use animal products like skins and ivory. So that's actually pretty cool. It was also during this time that Marshall finalized the script, named the original film Lions, Lions, and More Lions, which I'm not gonna lie is pretty on the nose. He also casted his wife Hedren and their 3 kids, John, Jerry, and Melanie, in the movie. But funnily enough, they only ended up acting in the film 5 years later, just due to how long production was taking. That's pretty much the entire family except for their other son, Joel. Joel's parents also offered for him to act in the movie, but he said no and instead became the set designer for the film, which is a smart decision. I'd probably also decline an acting role as soon as my parents said that my co-stars would be multiple untrained lions. Speaking of co-stars, Hedren and Marshall also began looking for lions, as they knew that they couldn't film this movie in Africa due to there ironically not being enough tame big cats there. This gave them 2 options. 1, they would try and find trained lions in the US for hire, and if they couldn't, then 2, they would try and find untrained lions and train them the Ozzy Bristow way, that being with hugs and kisses. I kid you not, that was their plan. They were just going to hug lions into domestication. And the funny thing is, it kinda worked. But alas, Hedren and Marshall ran into their first obstacle. You see, while they were visiting all these wildlife reserves, they met a veteran animal trainer in the film industry called Ralph Helfer. Marshall gave him the rundown of their movie that required roughly 30 to 40 trained lions, and Ralph, being a veteran animal trainer in the film industry, obviously shot them down, as he said, "You can't simply force a bunch of adult lions and strangers together. They have to be introduced gradually, or they may kill each other, or you." Now normally the fear of being killed by a lion would deter most people. But Hedren and Marshall weren't most people. And as 1970 came to an end, they attended a New Year's Eve party only to bump into a prospective writer named William Peter Blatty. Marshall would strike up a friendship, and eventually, a few years later, he would become the executive producer for the film The Exorcist. 1971 rolled around as Hedren and Marshall began looking for lions to rent when they came across a man named Ron Oxley, who would introduce them to his pet lion named Neil. Neil was a 9-foot-long cutie patootie, and he would become Hedren and Marshall's first live-in lion, as they would rent him out to come stay with them roughly 4 to 5 days a week. Now, before I continue, I should mention that this was technically illegal. During the early 1970s, it was legal to own your own lion, but it was illegal to do so in more populated areas, which is why Ron Oxley lived about an hour's drive outside of Los Angeles in Soledad Canyon, while Hedren and Marshall stayed at Nob Hill Drive, which was right in the middle of the city. And so began the illegal activity of Ron Oxley sneaking a 500-pound lion into Hedren's home at Beverly Hills. The plan went like this. Ron would drive a green van up to the house, open the back door to let Neil out, and then they would both skedaddle across the road and into the open door that Hedren was holding. And apparently no one ever noticed. They also did this in like the late afternoon evening, so it was broad daylight, but no one saw the 500-pound lion running across the road in a green flower van. Is it... Huh? It's just another day in Hollywood, I guess. It's crazy. It's crazy. It did take a while for Neil to become accustomed to the house, but once he did, he became a part of the family. His favorite pastimes would be laying by the pool and putting his paw on people's heads as he pushed them under the water. So he tried to drown them? Did no one ever address that? Hello? The lion tried to drown people? He also enjoyed letting out a roar or two in the garden, which obviously concerned the neighbors, who then phoned Hedren to tell her that they think they hear a lion in her backyard, to which Hedren just gaslit them by saying, "No, I think that's a motorbike revving. You're wrong." Imagine being the neighbor. "I think I hear a lion in their backyard. You know what? I'm gonna phone for their safety. Hedren, hey, I think I hear a lion roaring in your backyard." And Hedren's just like, nah. But all things considered, Neil was truly a very well-mannered lion. He was playful, he didn't intentionally hurt anyone, and he was comfortable around people. Ron told Hedren that it took a few years for him to form this bond, and Hedren wanted to know how she could do that as well. To which Ron simply said, "Get a lion cub as soon as possible, and start raising it." I'm sorry? That's how you domesticate a lion? Just treat it like a house pet and hope it has a friendly personality? We'll soon find out that this method both works, but also it doesn't, as some lions turn out great, while others try to scalp you. I would also like to mention that Hedren did actually have 2 normal pets. She had a dog named Partner and a cat named Poos. Unfortunately, Hedren's newfound passion for lions would mean that she would have to lock both Partner and Poos away in a room while Neil came to visit to stop the lion from eating them. And this was only the beginning, as Marshall and Hedren would soon start collecting lions like Pokemon, turning their house into a training gym for ferocious felines. The first lion cub they adopted was named Casey. Casey would be the one to teach Hedren and Marshall all about the difficulties that came with raising lions. And I think it's important to note that they were very eager to learn. See, Hedren knew that the eventual goal of getting roughly 30 trained lions was not going to be an easy task. Little did she know that they would eventually own over 150 big cats, but that's still to come. For now, they were satisfied with Casey. At least, that's what they thought. But then word got out that the Marshalls would accept pretty much any stray cub, and that's how one lion turned into 6. Soon they welcomed another 5 cubs named Nidra, Mike, Ike, Trance, and Bridget to the family. Also, to answer the question of where these lion cubs were coming from, it was primarily 2 places. One was zoos who couldn't financially support any lion offspring, and 2 were people who bought lion cubs thinking that this would be a great pet to have, and gravely underestimated their destructive nature. The 6 cubs Hedren was raising would pull curtains off the railings and play tug-of-war with bedsheets. And to the family's dismay, a lot of their house didn't survive. Water break. And I do want to highlight just how much the family fell in love with the animals during this time, especially Hedren. They really did care for them and tried to learn as much as they could about lions and their behavior. I know I'll probably make a lot of jokes throughout this video, I mean, I already have, but I really do have the utmost respect for both Hedren and Marshall because in the entire 11 years it took to make this project, not once did they ever mistreat the animals, nor did they ever blame them for the injuries that did occur. They always took full responsibility, even when everything fell apart. Anyways, 1971 was coming to a close, and the notable moments from this year included the time Melanie brought Casey to school to prove that she wasn't lying about owning a pet lion. That must have been a crazy show and tell day. Moving on, Marshall signed William Peter Blatty as a client, and Hedren got to read the original manuscript for The Exorcist, which is just really cool. And then the neighbors did eventually call animal control, who pitched up, took one look at the lion cubs, and then thought, you know what? Today's gonna be an off day. Goodbye. Oh, and then lastly, Casey escaped. Hedren noticed him walking down the road towards an intersection, so she grabbed a leash and chased after him, trying to get his attention by yelling. When she realized that that wasn't working, she started limping back to her house, hoping that this would trigger Casey's hunting instinct to attack injured animals. It worked, and Hedren quickly went from limping to sprinting as she ran up the road being chased by a lion and eventually got him back inside the house. And again, no one seemed to notice a woman getting chased by a lion up the road. It's just another Wednesday, my dudes. At the start of 1972, police finally showed up and told Hedren that she needed to vacate all the illegal lions. So she called Steve Martin. No, unfortunately it wasn't the comedian. Steve was an animal handler who owned the land in Soledad Canyon, but for the sake of this story, just picture Steve Martin. Marshall would actually go on to buy the acres of land in Soledad Canyon because it was apparently cheaper to buy it instead of renting it for all the eventual lions that they planned on getting. Marshall also told Hedren that this would be the set for the movie as they started building a replica of the abandoned farmhouse they saw in Africa. They also began building chain-fenced compounds for the assumed 50 or so lions they planned on getting for the film. Speaking of which, 8 more lions were added to the family. This included Togar, Alice, Jenny, Susie, Buddy, Bugsy, and my new favorite name so far, Scarface. P.S. All these lions were already young adults, meaning that none of them were tame. They also got 2 tiger cubs, to which Hedren asked Marshall a pretty important question. How were they going to explain that in the movie? Because tigers aren't native to Africa. To which Marshall just said, "We'll cross that bridge when we get there." They never crossed that bridge. No one throughout the entire movie told us why there were tigers living in Africa. And for the rest of the year, they would get a lion almost every week, accepting any cubs that they could find. It was also during this time that Marshall bought an African bull elephant, to which Hedren asked another valid question. In the movie, you're gonna call lions, lions, and more lions. Where does the elephant fit in? And Marshall's nonchalant response, once again, was, "It'll make the film more authentic." I'm really hoping you're starting to understand why the plot for this film was as flimsy as it was. Now in September, they got 4 more lions and a tiger named Peaches, Berries, Cherries, Cookie, and Igor. Of which, you're gonna want to remember Cherries. She's gonna be a reoccurring menace. Hedren and Marshall also expanded the crew as they needed help looking after all the animals, and by the end of 1972, they had a total of 25 big cats. Funnily enough, the only animal they said no to because they thought it was just too dangerous was a hippo. So that's where you draw the line. 25 lions, that's safe enough, but 1 hippo? That's way too dangerous. I mean, come on. You know how scary hippos are? They are actually really terrifying. Anyways. At the start of 1973, Hedren began commuting to Soledad Canyon pretty much daily, while Marshall went off to begin production on The Exorcist. The big cat population would continue to grow as they welcomed Frankie, Brutus, Nero, Johnny, Hoodoo, and my new favorite name, Lurch. They literally named a lion after the thing it will do when it attacks you. Fantastic name. Alice and Togar also gave birth to Bill, who would be the first lion cub to be born in Soledad Canyon. They also acquired a cheetah named Pharaoh because at this point they already had lions and tigers, so why not include cheetahs too? You see, Hedren wanted to be the very best, like no one ever was. To catch them was her real test, to train them was her cause. She traveled across the land, searching far and wide. These big cats she wanted to understand the roaring that's inside. Pokemon. Also, a funny side note, One day, while Pharaoh was staying at Nob Hill, Hedren came home to find out that he had escaped. She then spent the next few hours panicking as there was a cheater on the loose in Beverly Hills. Luckily, the police called and told her that they had found Pharaoh, but that they had also arrested him and he had to spend the night in jail because Hedren could only fetch him the next day. It was also during this time that Hedren started taking a lot of the big cats to the vet to get treated for varying illnesses, and a lot of these animals ended up getting saved because of the early treatment as soon as symptoms started to appear. And Hedren notes that if these cats had been living in the wild, some of them may have probably passed away rather early on in life. Now, I will say that kind of thinking still doesn't justify taking these animals out of their natural habitats or wildlife reserves and shoving them into places like zoos. But at least from what I've researched, all of the animals that lived in Soledad Canyon were very well taken care of. So much so that most of them didn't even want to leave. Funnily enough, lions are actually pretty lazy, and turns out as long as they're well fed, they would gladly stay because they didn't have to exert themselves by hunting for food. With that being said though, there was an incident where the neighbors came to visit the compound because they thought this would be a fun family outing. Right? Hedren was confident in the lion's domestication, but that didn't stop Nidra from charging and attacking a child. Luckily, no one was hurt, but Hedren was shocked at Nidra's behavior. She was heartbroken that this lion she raised from a cub would go for a small, feeble-looking child. As she said, it wasn't like her at all. Listen, a lion is still a lion. No amount of domestication is going to change the fact that it still has animal instincts. Nidra was neither good nor bad. She wasn't questioning the morality of attacking a child. She was just following her instincts to hunt prey. No number of hugs and kisses is going to get rid of that. And this is something that Hedren and everyone, at least in the early days, seemed to forget a lot. It was also on that day that they banned anyone under the age of 18 from entering the compounds. So valuable rule made. Also, I just want to reiterate so that you can get the mental picture. It wasn't that the neighboring family came and stood outside the compound fences and looked at all the lions from a safe distance. No, Hedren believed in their domestication. Thus, she let them into the compound to go and pet the lions. It's that kind of close proximity that we're dealing with. It's terrifying. You let your kids walk into that. Oh, it's a nightmare. The 70s, man. Crazy times. After that situation, Hedren and Marshall were really motivated to try and learn as much as they could about big cat behavior, specifically situations that could prompt aggression, in which they found 3. 1 was messing with the lion's food. Don't do that. 2 was interrupting a lion's romantic endeavors, if you understand what I mean. If you don't, go watch The Lion King, I'm sure you'll learn. And 3, which was arguably the most dangerous behavior, which were moments of possessiveness. You see, a lion can become overly possessive of an object or even a person, and any attempt to remove said object or person will be met with a whole lot of ferociousness. This possessiveness can happen at random and is often difficult to predict, and most of the injuries that I do talk about were a product of this behavior. And again, it's not the lion's fault. Hedren says that they, the people, are to blame for putting themselves in those situations. So just don't put yourself in those situations. But I digress. And speaking of people being in rather unfortunate situations, we have our first rather serious injury. 2 new lions were added to the family, called Zuru and Tongaroo. One day, John took Tongaroo out for a little walk, as one does with their untrained lion. And if there's one thing you should never do around a lion, it's trip and fall, which is exactly what happened to John as Tongaroo took the opportunity to attack. And for the next 20 minutes, Tongaroo, the lion, had John's head clasped in his jaws as Steve Martin and another animal handler named Jeff cycled through their non-aggressive tactics to get the lion off him. The first attempt involved them using fire extinguishers to try and scare Tongaroo off him. Didn't work. The second attempt involved them wobbling sheet metal to try and distract Tongaroo. That obviously didn't work. And finally, on the third attempt, they ran at Tongaroo with a 2.5 meter wide piece of plywood as a means to intimidate him, and thankfully he backed off and they could finally rush John to the hospital. It must have been terrifying feeling this huge lion bite down on your skull as you look and yell for help and you just see 2 fully grown men standing there like... This was only the first of many injuries, and filming hadn't even begun, as Hedren and Marshall was still in the process of trying to find funding for the movie, which proved to be rather difficult, as Hedren said, "What we were trying to do involve a number of humans and free-running lions and tigers in more or less uncontrolled situations had never been done before." Yeah, I wonder why. Does that sentence not raise any red flags? Is it just me? Am I the crazy one? Regardless, in December of 1973, Hedren and Marshall wanted to film a test shoot to show investors what this movie could potentially look like. The scene they had in mind involved Hedren falling on a log, and then they would have a pride of lions hop over her. And just a quick reminder, up until this point, the one thing Hedren repeatedly says is that you should never go lower than a lion, or else it's like you're inviting it to play with you. Keep that in mind, as Hedren lies down in front of 20 of them. The scene almost goes perfectly until the last lion in the group, Cherries, notices the human laying right in front of her. Cherries then locks in and bites Hedren's head, and to this day, Hedren says she can still remember the sound of lion's teeth scraping against her skull. Marshall then ran in with a few other animal handlers and pulled Cherries off, to which they then rushed Hedren to Palmdale Hospital, and you're going to want to remember that hospital name because it's going to be a reoccurring location. Fortunately, Hedren wasn't gravely injured, although she did need stitches. That night, after everything had calmed down, Hedren told Marshall that that was the most traumatic thing that had ever happened to her, and justifiably so. You almost died, and you would think that after a traumatic experience like that, they would reconsider filming the promotional shoot. But they didn't, and shot it again anyways. The only thing they changed was firing Cherries and crushing her dreams of becoming a method-acting lioness. As 1973 ended, they decided that Marshall would play Hank, as they couldn't find anyone else who would be willing to take on the lead role. I wonder why. Some articles speculate that Hedren and Marshall wanted to get Jack Nicholson for the lead, which I can't find a source to back that up, but it would have been really interesting. This also meant that Marshall would become the director, the producer, the writer, the casting director, the set architect, the financer, the lead actor for the entire movie, while his family played all the supporting roles. And that's why they call it a family film. It was at this point that they started planning on how they would shoot the movie. As Hedren says, the script was more so an outline except for the human-only scenes. And the idea was that they would just roll 6 cameras at all times and hope that the lions did something cool. That's also why they gave some of the lions writing credits, because they wrote the spontaneous moments. I mean, yeah, fair. Get your bag, dude. Or what do lions get paid in? Get your beef? No. Get your T-bone steak. And for the next year, the big cat population would continue to grow as Hedren and Marshall sustained various injuries. On 2 occasions, Hedren got bitten in the shoulder and arm, while Marshall contracted blood poisoning and almost died due to an infected lion bite. That actually happened. That's crazy. Meanwhile, at the start of 1975, The Exorcist was crushing it at the box office, so both Hedren and Marshall were really excited about the funding it would provide for their movie. And thus the curse of The Exorcist was transferred. At least, I suspect. It's hard to tell, but everything from this point just goes so downhill. Marshall also changed the title of the film from Lions, Lions and More Lions to Roar, as the previous title was a bit too long for marketing reasons, and I agree, the previous title was a catastrophe. See what I did? The catastrophe. Anyways, unfortunately, on a sadder note, later that year, an unidentified virus broke out amongst the big cats, claiming the lives of 14 lions and tigers. Hedren and Marshall brought in doctors and vets from all over the country, but they still couldn't figure out what was wrong, and the best that they could do was just isolate the animals and wait it out. Spirits were low, and to make matters worse, a fire broke out around Soledad, but luckily it didn't spread into the canyon. At this point, Hedren and Marshall started to feel rather defeated, and they started to wonder how this situation could get any worse, right? And if you've watched any movie ever, you'd know that you should never utter those words. Because shortly after the bushfires, Marshall found out that he wouldn't get paid for his work on The Exorcist, as apparently the deal he made with William Blatty had been a verbal one, and without any formal paperwork, William wouldn't pay. So they obviously sued, but they would only see those profits from the movie a few years later. And towards the end of 1975, they ended up selling both their home at Nob Hill as well as their 2 rental houses in Beverly Hills to help cover costs in Soledad Canyon. You see, it was costing them $4,000 per week to cover the costs of feeding and taking care of all the animals. That's upwards of $20,000 today if you factor in inflation, and that was per week. Hedren and Marshall were in too deep at this point, and any thoughts of backing out were left with their homes in Los Angeles. But even though they said they were broke, they kept getting more animals. At the end of 1975, they owned plus minus 80 big cats. They also bought 2 more Siberian tigers named Snai and Panda Bear. And who's naming these animals? Because I want to shake their hand. Like, it's so fun to just imagine 2 blokes standing there in the compound saying, "Oh, dude, we got another lion coming in today, eh? What should we name him?" "I don't know, eh? What about dog?" "Dog? But it's a lion there, man." "Oh, no, that's why it's funny, eh? Call a lion, here comes a dog. Call a dog, here comes a lion. I like your sense of humor there, Butch. I like you too, Butch." And if you're wondering, as for where the family was staying, they bought 2 mobile homes that they set up in Soledad Canyon, so basically everyone was on site now. Marshall was almost done building the set so that they could finally start filming, and in August, at long last, they got some good news. After years of looking for investors, a British entertainment company called EMI and a Japanese producer named Banjiro Omura would provide funding for $500,000 each. And on October 1st of 1976, they would triumphantly begin filming the first scene of Roar. It took 6 years to get here, and we still have 5 even more disastrous ones to go. And before we get into production, let me just introduce you to our cast and crew. It'll be worth it, trust me. A young Jan de Bont would be hired as the resident cinematographer for this film. He would then go on to direct Speed, with Keanu Reeves, as well as go on to direct one of my childhood crush movies, Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, and The Cradle of Life. So the man's got style. And a funny side note, Hedren said that one of the reasons they hired him was because he was European, and thus they assumed he wasn't afraid of lions? Europeans, can you confirm? I don't know, Europe was famous for its fearlessness towards lions, but that was interesting. They also hired Charlo Mativo to be Hank's assistant. Mativo was a native Kenyan who was studying film in America and was the only cast member who had real experience with wild lions. He was also one of the only people to walk out of this film unscathed, as he always took proper caution when interacting with the animals. Meaning he didn't think giving them hugs and kisses was a great idea, and throughout the entire movie, he constantly calls Hank crazy for living with lions. And it's so funny because I think he's just being honest and he's not actually acting. And then of course, there was Hedren and Marshall with their 3 kids who were now all grown up, John, Jerry, and Melanie. John was busy studying film at UCLA, Melanie was working her way towards becoming an actress, and Jerry, according to Hedren, was a hoe. Now before you call me out on saying that, let me quote Hedren verbatim. Jerry's favorite pastimes were girls, body surfing, and tennis. Easygoing Jerry would have been perfectly happy playing tennis 7 days a week and seeing a different girl every night. I was just reading it as it is. Your own mother wrote that. Now, most of the crew consisted of locals, maintenance workers, and non-union film staff. That last one's going to be very important later on. Hedren and Marshall couldn't hire any professional animal handlers because the ones that they did reach out to turned them down. These professionals would tell Hedren and Marshall that this film was a bad idea and that it was extremely dangerous to cram that many lions with people and lights and cameras in one room. So the animal handlers they did get were just crew members that had an affinity towards the big cats, so they got promoted, or maybe demoted, depending on how you feel about working with lions. And then 2 days before filming, they briefed the freshly hired crew on how to handle themselves amongst the lions. Not exactly something I would have done 2 days before filming, but I'm not alone thinking that. 2 people walked out on the spot after watching Hank charge an angry lion with a piece of plywood. And literally that afternoon, Hedren for the first time thought, perhaps this film was too dangerous to make. Well, it's too late now, so let's finally get into the filming of Roar, which they estimated would cost them $3 million and 6 months to make. And I'll tell you now, both of those estimates were gravely misjudged. Less than a month goes by, and so much went wrong. In the first week, Casey the lion punctured a hole through Marshall's hand, causing production to halt, and I actually think they kept that scene in the movie. Anyways, this became a reoccurring issue as someone would get injured on set, thus causing production to stop, and then they would have to wait for whoever it was to heal. While Marshall was recovering, the crew found out that the lions loved to destroy the sandbags that held up the lighting and camera equipment. This constantly messed with shots as the big cats would drag the sandbags into scenes while knocking the lights over. 2 weeks into filming, and a fight broke out between Tongaroo and Casey, which was so bad that it scared Melanie out of acting in the movie, as she told Hedren, "Mother, I don't want to come out of this with half a face." Firstly, I don't blame her, and secondly, unbeknownst to Melanie, that was some tragic foreshadowing. And also, I just want to mention, they casted Melanie's friend Patsy Ned in her role, but I don't think she had nearly as much experience working with lions, which just feels so irresponsible. But again, at this point, I digress. 3 weeks into filming, and there was a scene that Jan de Bont wanted to film, which involved lions jumping over the camera. So they dug a hole and set up a tarp. Off to a great start. Marshall only allowed Jan de Bont to do the scene because he and his assistant agreed to wear football helmets in order to protect their heads. Once filming began, Jan quickly realized that he couldn't see through the camera lens with the helmet on, so of course he took it off. And then Cherries entered the scene. Quick flashback, one of Cherry's favorite games as a cub was trying to catch toes under the blanket. Cute, right? Fast forward to the present where she spots a big circular bump poking out of the ground, and you can guess what happened next. Jan de Bont would be rushed to Palmdale Hospital where he got 120 stitches as they sewed his scalp back on. But even after that, this absolute legend came back to filming 3 weeks later. Why? Because this movie wasn't going to film itself, and Jan wouldn't let a little bit of hair loss stop him. Unfortunately, on the same day that Jan was taken to the hospital, his assistant, along with almost the entire crew, resigned on the spot after witnessing what happened. And thus, throughout all of October, November, and December, they only filmed a total of 26 days. And the devastating part was that most of that footage wouldn't even be useful for 2 reasons. 1, I mentioned earlier that they would just roll cameras and hope the lions did something. Well, the lions really didn't do much, making a lot of the footage pointless. And 2, Melanie would reprise her role as Melanie, meaning all the family scenes they'd already shot needed to be reshot as Patsy was kicked out of the pride. I guess her acting wasn't perfect. I'll stop with the puns. To really emphasize how long it took to get usable footage, there is a scene in Roar where 2 tigers are riding on the back of an old Chevy. It took 7 weeks to train them just for that one scene, and you best believe Marshall included as much of it in the movie as possible. Hedren comments that there were a lot of uncertainties while filming, as most of the cats were allowed to do whatever they wanted. There were days where nothing happened, and then there were days where the family would be chased by Tongaroo, one of the most aggressive lions in the entire compound, and Marshall would call that cinema. For example, there's a scene where the family climbs into a boat as they try to row away from the house, only for Tongaroo to hold the entire boat back with one paw. That was one of the quirky, unscripted moments written by the lion, along with the scene where he bashed down a door in order to kill the entire family. It was terrifying. 1977 rolled around, and filming would continue whenever someone wasn't injured and the lions felt like performing. A certain scene that Hedren was not exactly excited about was inspired by a silent comedy. The scene involved a jar of honey being knocked over and spilling onto Hedren's face, to which a big cat would hopefully lick it off her. They had no real way of testing this, so after everything was set up, they just yelled action and hoped for the best. The first take did fail, as the jar of honey didn't land on the counter and instead fell 4 feet and whacked Hedren in the head. The second take went perfectly as the honey spilled over Hedren's face, and now came the scary part. The room was filled with about 6 leopards and cougars, of which Pepper would walk up to Hedren and start licking her face. Hedren said that, although we played it for laughs, she realizes now that it was probably one of the most dangerous scenes in the entire movie. If you do watch this movie, and I hope you do, please tell me if you found that scene funny, because I was so anxious watching a terrified Hedren sit dead still as Pepper walked up and licked her face. One wrong move and that cat could have bit her nose off. It was also during this time that both Hedren and Marshall started thinking of ways that they could include Timbo the elephant in the movie, although he was a bit difficult to train. You see, Timbo was a bit of a rascal. His favorite pastimes included sitting on people's cars and flattening them, and if the car or vehicle wasn't close by, he would chuck stones and snipe window shields from a distance. And also not just cars, any metal contraption wouldn't stand a chance. One time while Timbo was on a walk, he came across a D8 tractor and thought it was challenging him, so he started charging it. Someone thought that turning on the engine would show Timbo that it wasn't a real animal, but that just made it so much worse. While charging and destroying the tractor, Timbo accidentally knocked over the compound fence for the tigers, and several of them temporarily escaped. And you'll never guess how they calmed Timbo down. They gave him several cases of beer. What? So it turns out Timbo was a bit of an alcoholic. Whenever he started causing tomfoolery, the animal handlers would give him at least 2 cases of beer to calm him down. Hedren did say that this couldn't negatively affect Timbo, as he also drank around 50 gallons or 190 liters of water a day. But based on this image of Timbo drinking beer, he might have been a lightweight. I personally think Timbo did get drunk, and this may have caused him to develop a bit of an abusive personality, but we'll get to that later. For now, Timbo is going to be a movie star. Or an FYI, looking past the jokes, don't give alcohol to an elephant, or any animal for that matter. I'm not a vet, but I'm pretty sure it'll do more harm than good. As for the scene Marshall wanted Timbo to star in, let's just say Timbo took the classic saying, break a leg, a little too seriously. The shot would begin with the family in the rowboat as they try to escape the lions. They would then encounter an elephant that would overturn the boat, pick up Hedren, drop her back into the water, and then the elephant would destroy the boat. A little ambitious, but what could go wrong, right? They would then go on to buy several metal rowboats, as Timbo liked the metallic crunching sound they made when he destroyed them, and then they attempted the first take. Now up until this point, Hedren had been practicing a lift technique with Timbo, where she would cross her legs so that the trunk wouldn't go in between them, putting less pressure on her lower body. And on the day, everything went rather well, except for one tiny little detail. Timbo wouldn't drop Hedren back into the water, he would walk over and drop her on the ground. Fast forward 13 takes later, each one having to be reshot because Timbo would pick Hedren up, walk over to solid ground, and then drop her. Unfortunately, on the 13th take, Hedren didn't quite get both her legs together in time, and her right leg would get pinned between Timbo's tusk and his trunk, causing Hedren to fall backwards. The pain was so intense that Hedren passed out on the spot as everyone rushed in to help her. When she woke up in Palmdale Hospital, she found out that Timbo had squeezed her leg so hard he cracked her bone, causing a hairline fracture. That evening, when everyone got back to Soledad Canyon, Hedren and Marshall would attend the bi-weekly crew party to take their mind off that terrible day. They had to have 2 crew parties a month to keep morale up and everyone in a good mood while working on this movie. If that isn't a reflection on how disastrous it must have been working on this film, I don't know what is. Although Hedren did comment that her leg getting injured was a bit of a blessing in disguise, as they had to halt production once again because they ran out of money. In May, while Marshall was trying to find funding and Hedren was recovering, Jerry would bring his new girlfriend to come see the lions in Soledad Canyon. Another quick flashback. Mike, one of the cubs the family raised, loved destroying Jerry's tennis shoes as a kid. So, when present-day Jerry walked into the compound wearing a fresh new pair of sneakers, Mike just couldn't resist. Jerry was shortly rushed to Palmdale Hospital after Mike punctured his thigh while trying to chew the tennis shoes off his feet. Also, this is so funny to me. Jerry's new girlfriend was left behind in the rush and offered to drive Hedren to the hospital due to Hedren's injury making her unable to drive. When they arrived at the hospital, Hedren also got checked in, as a doctor took one look at her purple leg and told her she had gangrene. Yeah, turns out the tissue around the fractures started decaying, which required Hedren to get skin grafts. It was that serious and she didn't even realize. Hedren did actually say that the situation was rather funny if you looked past all the injuries, and I'm glad they were optimistic. It would take all of June and July for Hedren to start walking normally again, and during that time, a lot of what was left left of the crew resigned as there wasn't much filming being done. Marshall would still continue shooting on and off with whatever help he could find, and by the end of July, they had apparently shot 70% of the movie. If you're wondering how that's possible, because 70% is the majority of the movie and they apparently had no crew, just remember that the cast never left because the cast was the family. Most of the film itself were just shots of lions and then shots of the family frantically running away from lions, and then Jan de Bont and Marshall would operate the cameras. But if they shot 70% of the movie, how was there 4 years of production still to come? Great question, and the answer is really bad luck. Or a curse. Remember, Hedren and Marshall are yet to suspect that their movie was cursed, and we're about to hear how they got to that conclusion. In the first week of August 1977, EMI, one of the investors, would end their contract after watching the 70% of footage Marshall had filmed. But not only did they pull funding, they also asked for their $500,000 back. The footage was apparently so bad, they asked for a refund, and if they didn't get it, they threatened to shut down Soledad Canyon. The situation continued to grow dire as Marshall only had about $10,000 left, and on top of EMI's demands, it was still costing them roughly $4,000 per week to feed the animals and pay what was left of the crew. So Hedren and Marshall did the only thing I can assume rich Hollywood folks do when times are tough. They started a brand new business. The business was called the Film Consortium, and it was a TV commercial company, and the crew that was left in Soledad Canyon would also become the crew for the new business. This was somehow profitable enough to the point where they could keep up with the costs of the canyon, and then it wasn't specifically stated, but I believe Hedren and Marshall took out a loan to pay EMI back. Also, a funny side note, the remaining crew just started living in the canyon full time because the project has just been going on for that long, to the point where they formed like a little trailer park section called Gumsterville, which is just a fantastic name. Now, towards the end of August, there was a scene involving the family that needed to be filmed, and up until this point, Melanie was the last remaining family member to not have been seriously injured, and I think you can see where this is going. While the family was in a room with 25 big cats, Melanie crouched down to pet a cub when a lioness named Sheila jumped on her. The lion just wanted to play, and in doing so, she almost took out Melanie's eye. Melanie would shortly be rushed to Palmdale Hospital, and after getting facial reconstructive surgery and a few stitches, Melanie looked as good as one can after getting maimed by a lion. And again, you would think a traumatic experience like this would stop Melanie from returning to the movie, but she told Hedren that she's not quitting, she's gonna finish this film no matter what. And to be honest, I respect it. You gotta be really brave to want to come back, but you know who wasn't brave? The freshly hired crew they got a few weeks prior that all quit after witnessing Melanie's injuries. Hedren comments that she didn't blame them for quitting. She always knew that there would be the possibility of serious injury or even death, and that kind of danger wasn't for everyone. But you know who was a walking danger magnet? Marshall. There's a scene that got scrapped where Marshall put a camera on a boat and filmed from the dam's perspective. And since this was the 1970s, the camera needed a direct line of electricity to operate, so Marshall ran cables from the shore through the water and onto his metal boat. If there was even the slightest damage to those cables, he would have been fried. This man also treats every lion like it's his best friend. There's a scene in the movie, specifically the one where his hand gets punctured. Do you want to know how that happened? They cut to 2 fully grown lions violently battling each other, and then cut to Marshall's character sprinting in between them to break up the fight, as if he's a PE teacher breaking up a high school brawl. During the commotion, you see Marshall swing his hand away from one of the lions, and then he looks at it and it just starts streaming blood. And then for the rest of the movie, in some scenes Marshall's hand is bandaged while in others it's not, so enjoy that fun little continuity error. And as 1977 came to a close, Marshall had filmed a total of 145 days, of which hundreds if not thousands of hours wouldn't even end up making the final cut. I'd also like to mention that so far there have only been a handful of serious injuries, but if you do a quick quick Google search, you'll see that news articles reference 70 plus injuries that happened throughout production, which is technically true. Marshall estimated that there was at least 100 injuries that took place, but the reason we don't hear about most of them is because they weren't too serious. And the reason I put quotation marks around weren't too serious is because the injuries the crew did sustain were shallow bite marks, or not so deep claw slashes, which was just another Tuesday apparently. That's so crazy to me. I think everyone had reached a point of such extreme desensitization towards the lions and tigers that if an injury didn't require immediate medical attention or hospitalization, they probably just patched it up and continued filming, because at this point, any delay would mean that thousands of dollars would be lost. And I also have to constantly remind myself that saying there were 40 lions in the room with them doesn't really capture the fact that there were 40 fully grown, untrained lions in the room with them. Regardless, 1978 was about to be the worst year for this entire production, as the almost biblical events that were about to transpire would make Hedren and Marshall call into question the supernatural. That's not an over-exaggeration. I genuinely feel so bad for these people. In January of 1978, Marshall and Mativo were busy filming a scene indoors, with a room occupied by about 12 lions. Marshall's costume would be a shirt and shorts, but after getting dressed, Jan de Bont would tell him that he had to put makeup on his legs because he was too glaringly white. Marshall was offended, but after looking at the footage, he reluctantly agreed. And the moral of the story I'm about to tell you is never wear makeup around lions, or just get a light tan. As the scene began, a lion named George immediately took interest in Marshall's legs, as the smell of the makeup attracted the lion. Marshall, who if you don't know, doesn't have any formal acting experience, tried to brush George away while delivering his lines. George, who now wanted a bit more than a sniff, proceeded to sink his teeth into Marshall's knee and dragged him into the corner of the room. The crew then quickly ran in and pulled the lion off him, and do you know how Marshall responded to all of this? He hopped back to his position and told the crew to do a retake, meanwhile his kneecaps holding on with a hope and a dream. The crew then rushed him to Palmdale Hospital, and while there, a doctor said he needed to be taken into intensive medical care, but stubbornly, Marshall refused, got his knee wrapped up, and went back home. Fast forward 10 hours later, and Marshall was in a wheelchair popping pain pills like Tic Tacs because the puncture wounds started to get infected. And unfortunately for him, the very next day, Banjiro Omura would stop by with a few Japanese investors to see how things were going. I can only imagine how awkward it must have been for Marshall to be like, yeah, no, things are going super well here. Filming's on schedule, and I'm telling you right now, this film is going to be a hit. And the Japanese investors are just like, why are you in a wheelchair? Thankfully, the next day, Hedren took Marshall back to the hospital, and it turns out Marshall had once again contracted blood poisoning. The doctor said that if they had left it any longer, he might have lost his leg. So just a heads up, if you ever get bitten by a lion, please go see a doctor. And now you might be thinking, what are the odds of that happening? You never know. How could you know? Now, February rolled around, and with it came a whole lot of rain. Hedren didn't think much of it at first, but after 5 days of non-stop downpour, the small river that went through Soledad Canyon slowly grew wider. This wasn't too big of an issue though, as everything built in Soledad Canyon was well above the regular flood levels, but little did Hedren know there were a few things that weren't in their favor. For the past decade, the nearby railroads had constructed multiple berms to support the railway. And if you're like me and you didn't know what a berm is, it's those long raised strips of ground that help support roads, or in this case, train tracks. These berms would stop any floods from damaging the tracks, but they also unintentionally redirected any water towards the canyon. And as if that wasn't bad enough, 8 miles or 13 kilometers up the river was a small bridge that was rebuilt to be sturdier against flooding, which ironically caused it to form a small dam due to all the rainwater. And again, no one knew any of this as they all waited for the rain to stop. Then on the 9th of February, as the downpour continued and the weather forecast said that the eye of the storm would be passing over Soledad Canyon at midnight, Hedren prepared for the worst. She notes that everything was in that canyon. The sets they built, all the equipment they had, the $4 million they've already invested, but most importantly, all the animals they looked after. And Hedren wouldn't let anything happen to them, so she got to work. And if Obi-Wan Kenobi's infinite wisdom has taught us anything, we all know just how important the high ground is, and that's exactly where Hedren was headed. She called everybody she knew that could come and help move those animals, and that afternoon, groups of people started to gather, offering to help in any way they could. And as the storm continued, with the night creeping up on them, the lions grew more anxious as the river rose. The crewmen brought in multiple cattle cars to aid in moving the lions, but there was just one problem. The gaps in the cattle cars were too wide, meaning the lions could just hop out at any time, rendering the trailers useless. That was until one man entered the scene. One man on a mission, and his name was Chris Galucci. He was the on-site welder for Soledad Canyon, and for the next 15 hours straight, at night, in the rain, all you would see was sparks flying as he secured the cattle trailers, making it possible for the animals to be transported out of there. I cannot emphasize enough just how miserable this evening was. It was absolute chaos as the rain was crashing down on everyone. People were yelling all over the place. Beams of light broke through the darkness, illuminating human fences that were guiding anxious lions away from the rising river. When the cattle trailers were full, people started using camper vans or even their own cars to help transport the animals out of there. But don't be mistaken, this was a slow process, as they had to correctly group each pride of lions and tigers, or else fights would break out between the big cats, causing the other ones to flee. So one by one, the animals would be vacated, and by midnight, Marshall would call Hedren and told her that finally the weather forecast said that the eye of the storm had passed. Everyone took an exhausted sigh of relief. Except Hedren, because she noticed that the water level was still rising. And then, at 1:45 a.m., Yandabont came sprinting down the hill. His wife Monique had just told him that she heard that the bridge in Aliso Canyon, the canyon that was just above Soledad, had collapsed, and a mile-long dam of water was now rushing towards them. They had 15 minutes before a 10-foot wave would come crashing through the canyon, destroying everything in its path. Hedren immediately went to her house and grabbed anything of importance, and then drove back up the hill to drop it all off. On her second trip, she came to a stop about halfway down the hill as she got out of her car and looked up at the canyon. The wind picked up and the ground started to rumble as a huge wave of water washed through the canyon, taking everything with it. Everyone was devastated, but there was no time to let it sink in as the last group of animal handlers and lions got caught in the wave. There was also still apparently 4 crew members asleep in Gumsterville when the flood hit, and they were stuck now as well. The few animal handlers that got caught in the wave managed to swim to safety, but Tongaroo, Togar, Zuru, Melanie, Cherries, and a few other lions all were still splashing anxiously in the water, looking for something to stand on. And then a small island started to form on the one side of the canyon. It was about 50 to 60 feet wide, and this is where a lot of the animals took refuge from the flood, as well as 2 or 3 exhausted animal handlers. But even then, in that darkness, Tongaroo and Togar started fighting, and that caused the other lions to panic, which then caused the exhausted animal handlers to run around trying to calm all the lions down. It was an absolute mess. In an attempt to take back control, Hedren opted for their last resort, tranquilizers. She gathered a few trained animal handlers who all started putting to sleep the lions who were causing the most commotion. And finally, after an hour of just total chaos, the situation was under as much control as you could expect. And unbeknownst to anyone, the lioness Melanie and Mary had both been swept downriver. On a little bit of a funny side note, the Los Angeles firefighters came to rescue the 4 crew members stuck in Gumsterville, but upon arrival, Chris Galucci told them that, hey guys, there's lions on the loose, just be careful. And then the firefighters made a U-turn to go fetch a helicopter instead. Anyways, the most anyone could do right now was wait for the water to subside and for daylight to arrive. Now, just past Soledad Canyon was a trailer park who were all awake as they expected a potential flood. And at 3:30 in the morning, a resident saw 2 lions walking around in the darkness. Hedren notes that everyone in that trailer park were well aware of the movie being filmed in Soledad Canyon, but instead of calling Hedren, they called the sheriff first. And tragically, 30 minutes later, the two scared and cold lionesses, Mary and Melanie, were shot by the deputies on arrival. Hedren says she didn't blame anyone for what happened and that it was a tragic mistake. Melanie and Mary, although not 100% tame, were two of the more friendly lionesses in the compound. They weren't attacking anyone in that trailer park, nor were they causing any trouble, and I'm struggling to understand why the sheriff's first response was to shoot them. Because right after the trailer park called the sheriff, they then called Hedren and told her that two of her cats are here, to which Hedren then sent out an animal handler with a tranquilizer to go and fetch them, but upon arrival, the lionesses were already dead. Meaning the trailer park knew that an animal handler was on the way, but did they tell the sheriff that? I know I've made a lot of jokes throughout this video about the people behind this film, but I still admire them because they're able to put their fear aside in order to love an animal most would consider dangerous. And just because something has the potential to be dangerous doesn't mean your first response should be to kill it. Hedren was right, it was tragic, but it looks like a mistake that could have been avoided if the trailer park residents or the sheriff were just a little bit more open-minded about lions. Which I know is a crazy thing to say, but you didn't have to shoot the animals, come on man. And trust me, I understand that the comedic aspect of this film is the crazy premise of a family deliberately choosing to live with 40 untrained lions. But it's important to know that behind the idea was a genuine love for these animals, with everyone being open-minded enough to believe that these big cats could be something more than the ferocious beasts people make them out to be. It is a gray area. It's not to say that you should get a lion as a pet, but also don't assume that lions are these bloodthirsty killers either. It is a fine line to walk, and unfortunately, Melanie and Mary wouldn't be the only casualty that day. When dawn arrived, a few animal handlers laid out meat piles to attract the remaining 14 lions that were still busy wandering around. The plan almost worked as all the big cats started to gather, but before the animal handlers could use their tranquilizers, the sheriff's helicopter swooped past in order to get a better view, thus making all the big cats scatter once again. They then had to be tediously captured one by one. Two of the last big cats at large were Robbie the lion and his best friend Gregory the tiger. A bit of backstory, Robbie was one of the friendliest lions in Soledad Canyon. He was so well-mannered in fact that both Hedren and Marshall decided to make him the lead lion in the movie due to how well-trained he was. While in the compound, Robbie befriended Gregory the tiger and they quickly became best friends. They would always hang out together and play together, and eventually they became inseparable, which is why in all of the chaos that had just transpired, Robbie was being possessive over Gregory as he was trying to protect him. They had just been hit by a 10-foot wave of water in pitch black darkness, and after that nightmare, they'd been running around for hours trying to find a safe place to take refuge. I think it's safe to say they were scared. Steve Miller and Frank Tom, the animal handlers responsible for training Robbie and Gregory, were in the process of de-escalating Robbie's possessiveness as they had done multiple times before. While this was happening, some deputies were watching from the sidelines. Now you see, what Robbie would do when he was possessive was charge and feint an attack and then run back to whatever he was being possessive over. In this case, it was Gregory. This time, when Robbie charged Frank, one of the deputies dropped down to the ground, armed his rifle, and before Frank could yell "Don't shoot," fired 4 shots at Robbie. Robbie then staggered and tried to run to a bush for cover as the other deputies dropped to the ground, armed their rifles, and fired on the already fleeing and injured lion. After 20 shots, Robbie tragically passed away, protecting his best friend, Gregory. Then Frank, with tears streaming down his face, would take Gregory back to safety, all while mourning the loss over another big cat's passing. And with that, everyone, at least all the people, were safe. Almost all the animals would be saved except for Mary, Melanie, and, as Hedren puts it, the gentle star, Robbie. This was by far the saddest point in the story for me. Yeah, that sucks. Really sucks. While all of that was happening, Marshall had just found out about the flood, and instead of attending his own operation in a few hours, he somehow managed to get to his car and drive to Soledad Canyon. Remember, he was still in horrible shape, his leg was punctured and infected, and he had blood poisoning. Regardless, Hedren was surprised to see him limping over that morning, and that's when they found out about Robbie. They were devastated. Marshall was in the worst shape he had ever been throughout this entire project, project, while Hedren was completely exhausted after watching everything they had built get washed away. The only thing left for them to do was quite literally pick up the pieces of the film they questioned would ever get finished. And then a little ray of hope emerged from the flood as the water levels began to recede. The main set piece, the massive 2-story house that Marshall constructed, had not moved an inch. This was most likely due to the 14 telephone poles they used as a foundation, which ended up saving the house when the water hit. That's not to say that the house was in great shape. There was quite literally a car wedged into the living room with multiple trees sticking out of the walls, but at least the house was still standing, and that was enough to spark Marshall back into action. He limped over to start helping the other animal handlers move the remaining lions into cattle trailers, and immediately things went wrong. The second lion Marshall tried to move was still in a state of shock after the flood and bolted away from him. The chain that was connected to the lion's collar then wrapped around Marshall's punctured leg, and he was then dragged 200 feet before managing to free himself. Ever heard of the term add insult to injury? Well, now add injury to injury. At least that's what I thought, but after Marshall got ragdolled by a lion, he then drove himself back to the hospital and checked himself out. Why? Because the doctors apparently deemed the operation unnecessary after Marshall's leg got squeezed dry while being dragged by a lion. How is that possible? What sorcery is this? He had severe blood poisoning and could barely stand. How did a lion dragging him 200 feet through the dirt magically heal him? No one explained this to me. I also could not find a definitive answer, but I promise you, Hedren would say it was the charm of the lions that healed him. Anyways, the next few days flew by as everyone started cleaning up in an attempt to salvage whatever they could. Marshall would also sit down with Hedren and say, "We don't have any choice but to finish it, do we?" And Hedren agreed. Sunk cost fallacy 101, my friends. Simply put, they were in too deep at this point. Pun not intended, but appreciated. You see, just before the flood hit, Hedren said that they were over 80% done with filming, and they hoped to wrap everything up by April, which was just 2 months away. They had spent the better part of 8 years on this project, and quitting so close to the finish line was not an option anymore. For better or worse, Roar had become a part of their lives, and they had to see it through. Now, the silver lining of the storm that just passed was all the media coverage they were suddenly getting, and rightfully so. If my film's production just lost one of its 9 lives, it better make the front page of the Los Angeles Times, at least. Following all the attention from the newspaper were crowds of people offering to help with food, storage space for the big cats, portable fencing, the works. And by the end of the week, Soledad Canyon, along with other parts of Los Angeles, were declared disaster areas, which was great news for Hedren and the gang because that meant they qualified for a low-interest loan, baby. And another funny side note, if you're wondering where all the animals were staying after all the damage from the flood, they had taken up refuge in a local restaurant's parking lot, which was just a ways up the road. But after a few days, they did manage to move all the animals back to Soledad Canyon as they started rebuilding the compounds. And on February the 14th, Valentine's Day of 1978, Robbie Jr. would be born, and with him, the spirit of Robbie would live on. And if you thought this is the point in the story where we start to see the happily ever after ending, I'll quickly remind you that Hedren said Disney was capable of making this movie. Doesn't mean they did. After just 2 weeks of rebuilding, they managed to put together 2 compounds that were then washed away by another, not as intense but still bad enough to destroy all the progress they made, flood. On top of that, the new stories being written about Hedren and Marshall quickly turned from inspirational animal lovers to crazy obsessed fools. Suffice to say, things weren't looking great. They were tired, broke, and almost all their investors backed out after the flooding. And during this time of struggle, some longtime friends of Hedren wrote her a check of $50,000 as a gift for all the hardships that they went through, and Hedren said, "Moments like that lifted our spirits." I'd like to take a small break to quickly say, if any of my friends are watching this, or anyone at all really, $50,000 would really lift my spirits, as I think it would for almost everyone. So if you have a casual $50K lying around, call me. I'm kidding. Now 8 months would pass and Marshall would once again go out to look for investors, while Hedren and the family stayed in Soledad Canyon to help rebuild what was lost. The animal population would grow to roughly 150 big cats plus minus a few other different kinds of animals, of which Hedren notes that elephants were considered a sign of good luck, and they really needed more of that right now, so they bought another one. Her name was Kura, and I can just imagine Marshall knocking on Hedren's door saying, "Did you know elephants are a token of good luck?" And Hedren's like, "No, that's cool though, why is that important right now?" "Well, we could really use some more good luck." You didn't. Now the film's going to be double as authentic. Right after they got Kura, Marshall applied to the Small Business Administration, or the SBA, for their disaster loan, and how I understand it was, they had to screen the 80% of raw to a representative in order to compare what was in Soledad Canyon to the damages found after the flood. Raw basically functioned as proof of everything they had lost, which firstly sucks, and secondly, the guy they screened the movie to, William Ketchum, was so moved by the film that he promised to finalize the loan immediately. But 2 days later, and I quote, he dropped dead of a heart attack. And then Hedren writes directly after this that Kura, the elephant, did not seem to bring them much good luck after all, which just... I'm not laughing at the fact that someone passed away. That's tragic. I am laughing at the fact that Hedren and Marshall made it seem like, Kura didn't save that guy with her good luck. That's kind of messed up, Kura. What? Regardless, they managed to get their loan and filming was back on as Marshall managed to secure another $1 million from new investors. With just 10 minutes left of actual scenes they had to shoot, filming would start again in July. Now the set wasn't fully rebuilt yet, so they decided to start filming a scene where poachers get attacked by lions, and Hedren makes a brilliant point, but only after the events I'm about to tell you. She says that you should never try and teach a lion how to act aggressive because it will probably just be aggressive. Keep that in mind as the animal handlers teach Tongaroo and Zuru how to fake attack people. Okay, it's kind of getting a little chilly, so I'm just gonna go grab a beanie. Just give me 1 second, please don't go. Hello there. Okay, I got a beanie, my ears are warm, let's get back to the video. In preparation for the poaching scene, they began practicing the mock attack where they would bend by the waist, which would signal to the lion to pounce. While running through the scene, another animal handler named Doron, which is an interesting name, walked into the compound to speak to one of the animal handlers practicing the mock attack. When he walked past Tongaroo, he stopped to scratch the cutie patooty's chin, and when he went to stand up, he bent by the waist. Tongaroo then lunged onto Doron and bit him on the side of his neck and head, just barely missing his jugular. Steve and Daryl, the other two animal handlers in the compound, quickly pulled Tongaroo off as Doron crawled towards the exit, but Tongaroo, on a mission, broke free and lunged back onto Doron and bit him in the bum. At this point, more crew ran in to help, and they quickly rushed him to Palmdale Hospital, with Hedren saying that this would be the last and most serious casualty of Roar. Let's see if that statement holds. Filming was once again halted as they decided to finish rebuilding the set, and credit where credit's due, Joel and the maintenance team managed to rebuild everything almost perfectly, even the surrounding foliage. But since winter was on the way, all the leaves and plants started to turn brown, which left them with two options. 1, wait until summer next year, or 2, spray paint everything green and finish this movie once and for all. They chose the latter. Shooting would once again start on Friday the 13th of October, and for such an unlucky production up until this point, I would have been too much of a skeptic and opted not to film on a Friday the 13th during spooky month. And even Hedren backs me up by writing, "Why did we have to keep flirting with omen dates? You chose to start on that day!" And not only that, Hedren even told Marshall, "I think our luck has changed." And a month after saying that, they were broke again. Not much was done during November and December besides screening an almost complete Roar to a bunch of different movie studios, as well as Francis Ford Coppola, the guy who made The Godfather. Like, no one ever addresses that, they just threw it in there. Unfortunately, everyone seemed rather uninterested in the movie, which Hedren attributes to people wanting to see more violence and blood, which is ironic to say the least. Although the one positive response from people was that Roar genuinely had some of the best animal footage of big cats at the time. Regardless, with no one seemingly interested in their movie, both Hedren Hedren and Marshall began doubting even trying to finish it. And as the year came to a close, the last gift Hedren and Marshall received was accidentally breeding a Tiggin, half lion, half tiger, so at least 1978 ended on a cute note, until I saw what it looked like in the movie. Ugh, what even is that? 1979, look at the timestamp, we're almost done, I promise. It would be funny if I just threw in an ad break there.
Procrastination isn't a joke. What real benefit is there to learning about a lion movie?
But for real, thanks for watching. The new year saw Marshall, Hedren, and Yandabont flying off to Kenya to film the opening shots for the movie. This is where they filmed the one unscripted scene where Marshall races a bull giraffe on a motorbike. Terrifying, I know. This trip did also deplete the last bit of funding they had, to which Roar would go on another hiatus. They would film on and off doing pickup shots while trying to figure out how to end the open-ended plot Marshall wrote all those years ago. It was also during this year that Marshall would win the lawsuit against William Blatty, to which Warner Brothers would pay them their dues. And in August, with the money they got from The Exorcist, Marshall estimated that they had about just 1 week left of filming, and then Roar would be done. Just before that week could arrive though, Hedren got attacked by Boomer, one of the lions whose names aged so poorly. Just so that you have a broad idea of how freely some of these lions roamed, Boomer essentially walked into Hedren's house, pounced on her, and then ragdolled her against the walls. He would then bite her in the shoulder and only ran away when Marshall came screaming after hearing Hedren screaming. And that, my friends, would be the last serious casualty of Roar. Hedren goes on to say, and I quote, "I am not one who usually believes in hauntings, stray demons, or Egyptian curses, though it had occurred to me from time to time that Roar had an extremely unusual and prolonged run of troubles, and with our track record of inviting danger into the canyon, it seemed to me the only one we hadn't suffered so far was a fire." And you can guess what happened next. They constantly accidentally speak the thing they don't want to happen into existence. And I just feel so bad for them. On September the 13th of 1979, Marshall was getting ready to shoot the final scene for the movie. They were literally one scene away from being done, but Marshall decided to call things off as a nearby bushfire started to envelop the surrounding area. And the news would report that over 1,000 firefighters would spend the next day doing what they do best, fighting fire. But that didn't exactly reassure Soledad Canyon, as everyone stayed on high alert, getting ready to evacuate the animals at a moment's notice. And unfortunately, that moment arrived on Saturday afternoon when all the animals had to be moved due to the fast approaching fire. There is a haunting image of Marshall and 2 other animal handlers pulling a scared lion into a horse trailer, as you can literally see the fire spreading over the hill in the background. Luckily, they did manage to get all the animals out of the canyon in time, with the only casualty being a marabou stork that passed away due to smoke inhalation. And although the fire didn't spread to any of the buildings in the canyon, it did scorch the surrounding foliage, thus everyone had to wait another month for all the plant life to regrow. During that time, Hedren and Marshall finally sat down with the crew and genuinely considered the possibility that their movie was cursed. After the fire, Marshall couldn't ignore the similarities that happened behind the scenes on The Exorcist in comparison to Raw, which is wild. Imagine being pushed to the point where you must consider the possibility that something supernatural is trying to stop you from finishing your film. Marshall would go on to tell the local newspaper, "Yes, bad luck seems to have plagued me ever since that movie. The Exorcist's production was terrifying in the sense of the supernatural, and I think it was easier for everyone to sort of blame something that could be recognized as evil, like a curse or a demon, for example. Roar's production, on the other hand, was terrifying in a different sense. To me, it feels like everyone that worked on Roar was battling against Mother Nature herself. But alas, through fire and floods, along with every dangerous big cat under the sun, Hedren and Marshall would conclude filming on October the 16th, 1979. Hedren would also do her final head count, and for the moment you've all been waiting for, Roar would finish with a total of 71 lions, 26 tigers, 10 cougars, 9 black panthers, 4 leopards, 2 jaguars, 1 tiggin, 2 elephants, 6 black swans, 4 Canadian geese, 7 flamingos, 4 cranes, 2 peacocks, and 1 marabou stork. Rest in peace, buddy. Yeah, apparently they also had a few exotic birds to set dress the location, but I don't know how well that went with some of the lions running around the flamingos or peacocks. So, hey, I guess they survived. The following 7 months would involve Marshall and Janderbont working with editors to get pickup shots in order to patch up any plot holes. And also during this time, composer Terry Minogue and songwriter Robert Hawke would move into the canyon to start writing the soundtrack for Roar. Hedren says that they wanted to immerse themselves in the authentic environment that was the fake African safari set in Los Angeles, USA. Hedren would also name the canyon Shambala, which meant the meeting place of peace and harmony for all beings, animal and human. This name was recommended to her by Kermit the Frog. I'm not kidding. Steve Whitmire, who voiced Kermit after Jim Henson, was the guy who came up with the name for the canyon. Cause what do you mean? They literally named the preserve Shambala Preserve. Kermit the Frog came up with that. That's crazy. And on the 20th of September in 1980, the final cut of Roar would be screened to Paramount, Warner Brothers, and tons of other film studios in the US. There was just one problem. You see, the plan was that a large majority of the profits made from the movie would go into funding the retirement of all the big cats in Shambala. But according to Hedren, all the studios in the US wanted to take those profits for themselves, which is just a horrible thing to want to do. Although this is where a lot of news articles call Hedren and Marshall into question, because there should have been at least one studio that wanted to screen the movie, regardless of wanting any of the profits, right? But if you remember what I said way back in the video about them using non-union film staff, Hedren and Marshall had to hire independent film crews because the working conditions weren't exactly safe. If this video has pointed anything out, that was definitely true. So the unions of the film industry didn't exactly agree with the methods of production, and thus it's possible that no one wanted to screen their movie. An argument can be made for both sides, neither of which matter because they just took the film overseas. And after screening their movie in England, Germany, Japan, Australia, and Italy, Hedren and Marshall were hit with a tough realization. Roar wasn't exactly a good movie, and the hit blockbuster they thought they made was criticized as being an overpriced cat documentary. Ouch. Critics, come on. A bit too harsh, man. Jeez. As such, Hedren admitted defeat by saying, "We had defied the odds at every turn and had lost." Regardless, in October of 1981, they flew out to the one country that would love to premiere their movie. Australia. Seriously, if there was one place where people would watch Roar and think, wow, that was a funny slapstick comedy where no one was in any mortal danger at all, it would be the country that everyone jokes about the wildlife being able to kill you. The general audience consensus was that the film did truly show how magnificent these animals are in a way never seen before on screen. And that was unfortunately about the only good thing people had to say. Critics did what they do best and criticized many of the film's shortcomings, although no one seemed to judge too harshly due to how much of a struggle it took to make the movie, so that was at least a blessing in disguise. And thus, after the premiere, Roar was deemed the most disaster-plagued movie in all of Hollywood, a reputation which I think still holds up pretty well today. Roar would earn about $2 million back after releasing, whereas the total amount it took to fund the entire project over 11 years was around about $17 million. Also, apparently that $2 million in profits primarily came from Germany and Japan. I think Banjiro Omura finally got his money's worth. And then Hedren and Marshall would get divorced in January of 1982. It was a very mutual breakup, and they both just seemed to be in two very different places after finishing the movie, but they both did promise each other to keep looking after all the animals. Soledad Canyon would be rebranded as Shambala Preserve, a place Hedren would now call home. And as the years went by, Hedren would go on to write a book about her experiences throughout all of this chaos called The Cats of Shambala, which was my main source of information when researching this movie. And I only found out afterwards Kermit the Frog basically named the lion preserve as well as the book, which is just insane. Now, after Roar premiered, it kind of just fell off and became one of those movies you hear about that just sounds too crazy to be real. And the main reason it's garnered a lot more attention in recent years is because in 2015, Draft House Films, a film distribution company, revived the movie as they played it for a limited run in theaters. And this is where our generation saw it and could not believe something like this existed. Suddenly, Roar had a new wave of cinephiles adding it to their Letterboxd reviews as people were admiring Hedren and Marshall's determination to see the project through, which is just really cool to see. And as unbelievable as it is, the fact that nobody died directly due to this movie was a miracle. And looking past the injuries, the floods, the fires, the multiple crews quitting, and the most definite curse from The Exorcist, Roar as a movie is actually a really enjoyable film, but not for the reasons Hedren and Marshall intended. Personally, I think the best way to watch Roar is to read up about the makings of it, or just watch this video, and then go watch the movie, because knowing all the context behind how the film was made elevates the viewing experience to such a comedic level. Just knowing that in the 1 hour and 34-minute time span is 11 years worth of chaotic experiences where a family deliberately chooses to live with over 40 untrained lions. Now that's a movie that's never going to be made again and deserves at least one watch through. So I hope you enjoy watching Roar. It's not that hard to find on the internet, YouTube, and I tried my best not to spoil the ending because it makes no sense. It literally makes no sense. Like, I cannot. I was sitting there watching the movie, and the whole time the movie does one thing, and then at the end it completely switches things up, and I cannot. I was sitting there in disbelief, bamboozled, because what do you mean all of a sudden they were just... Calm down, calm down. It made no sense. It made no sense. Okay, and then I did want to say the Shambala Preserve is still open and ongoing, and they are working alongside the Roar Foundation, which was also founded by Hedren to support and care for endangered big cats. I'll try leave a link in the description below to their website where you can donate or help out. Poaching is still a massive issue all around the world, and I think getting more attention on it will hopefully help in some way. And despite what critics had to say about the movie, I really did enjoy watching Roar. If you can look past a lot of the questionable decisions made, here lies a film that might not have successfully achieved what it set out to do, but that's why I think it's such an enjoyable film. If I wanted to watch lions being lions, I could just watch a National Geographic documentary, but if I wanted to watch lions having fun terrorizing a family in a movie that was potentially cursed, well, now you know where to look. Roar might not have been the peaceful lion passion project Hedren and Marshall wanted it to be, and yet I found myself sitting on the edge of my seat, anxious and excited to watch a movie about lions. And just an interesting side note, when I went to their website to just browse around, I saw that Betty White was on their advisory board alongside Steve Whitmire, which means, canonically, Betty White and Kermit the Frog were friends with all the lions in Roar. And I think we're done. Hey, you made it to the end of the video. Congratulations. Only a few have traveled this far. I do just want to say thank you so much for watching. This is my first proper attempt at making a long form video, and if you have any suggestions on what weird, dangerous movie topic I should cover next, I'll be in the comments section congratulating the random person that typed first. Congratulations. With that being said though, fair warning if you are new here and watch any of my older content, because it's most certainly not video essays. If I refer to myself as Ted or Rex in any of those videos, run! I am a tiny creator who's doing video essays instead of the horror content that founded this channel, so basically I'm committing career suicide. And if you want to support me more directly, I will link my Patreon down below where you can watch my first reaction to when I saw Roar for the first time. There goes Melanie. They just got mauled to death by lions. So there's also a bunch of behind the scenes content there. And lastly, you'll get your name added to the end credits. Anyways, thank you for watching and I'll see you in the next video. Okay, hit it!